From Microbe TV, this is Beyond the Noise, episode number 75, recorded on July 21st, 2025. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today is your host, Dr. Paul Offit.
Hi, Vincent.
This is the video version of Paul's column on Substack called Beyond the Noise, Cutting to the Chase on Important Health Topics. Today, we're going to talk about Paul's recent column, Mercury Rising. Love that title, Paul. All about Mercury. So 25 years ago, the ACIP was considering what to do about thimerosal in vaccines. So do I pronounce it right? Thimerosal or thimerosal? Do you know?
I say thimerosal.
Thimerosal. Okay, you're the expert. Thimerosal in vaccines. So first, let's start. What is thimerosal and what does it do?
So thimerosal is ethyl mercury. It is a bacteriostatic agent. So really starting back in the 1930s, when multi-dose vials were used, and it would contain 10 doses. So you would take your needle and rubber stopper, violate that rubber stopper again and again as you would withdraw one dose after the next. And even though that vial would sit in the refrigerator, still it was possible you could have introduced bacteria, and that the child who received the 8th or 9th or 10th dose could have been inadvertently inoculated with bacteria or fungi. By adding that bacteriostatic agent, ethyl mercury, we eliminated that problem. So no longer did children have to suffer occasionally cellulitis, abscesses, or bloodstream infections caused by the inadvertent inoculation with bacteria in a multi-dose vial. So really, thimerosal has been in vaccines since the 1930s.
But only in multi-dose vials, not single-dose vials, correct?
That's right, yes.
So why was the ACIP considering the use of thimerosal?
So what happened in 1997, there was something called an amendment to the FDA Modernization Act, which read, the amendment gave the FDA 2 years to complete a list of drugs and food that contain intentionally introduced mercury compounds and to provide a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the mercury compounds on that list. Now, at the time, there were vaccines like the DTaP vaccine, the hepatitis B vaccine, the Haemophilus influenza B vaccine that were in multi-dose vials and contained then thimerosal. The problem at the time was there really was no standard for ethyl mercury, which was a synthetic product. The only standards were for methylmercury, which is a natural product. And methylmercury is very different than ethyl mercury in that it has a much longer half-life. I mean, methylmercury is a poison at high concentrations. It's not a poison at low concentrations, but it is a poison at high concentration. So what happened was they tried to say, okay, well, has ethyl mercury exceeded the guidelines for methylmercury? Methylmercury has a half-life of 50 days. Ethyl mercury has a half-life of 3 to 5 days and is excreted much more quickly from the body. And just to put this in context, mercury is in the Earth's crust. It's in an inorganic form. When it then comes to the top of the Earth by rock erosion or volcanoes, it's taken up by bacteria in the soil, bacteria in the seas, and then methylated. So it's not inorganic mercury anymore. Now it's organic mercury and can cross cell membranes. So assuming we live on the planet Earth, everything that is made from water on this planet has methylmercury in it. It's in the water we drink, it's in breast milk, it's in infant formula, it's in our bloodstream, as is true for many light and heavy metals. I mean, we have cadmium, beryllium, beryllium, thallium, and mercury and aluminum in our bloodstream. We have arsenic in our bloodstream, but not at levels that are dangerous. So as Paracelsus said in the 1500s, the dose makes the poison. So we all have mercury in our bloodstream. So when studies were done sort of looking at was thimerosal in any way an important addition to the burden of mercury that we encounter and manage every day, the answer was it wasn't. You couldn't tell that people who've gotten thimerosal-containing vaccines had an elevation in their mercury in their bloodstream because they already were exposed to far more just from living on the planet.
So, for example, when we eat food, in particular tuna fish, you get methylmercury in that, right?
That's right.
And that lasts a long time. You said it has a half-life of 50 or so days, correct?
Right. And methylmercury, they're at high concentrations can be toxic to the brain. So, for example, there was the Minamata Bay disaster or the Iraqi fumigated grain disaster, where people were exposed to large quantities of methylmercury, which damaged the unborn child. And so, sure, I think you do worry about methylmercury at large quantities, but that's not the quantities that you're exposed to from just living on the planet.
So, what was the impetus for this FDA legislation? Was that Congress that did that?
Yes, it was Congress. People like Frank Pallone in New Jersey, a New Jersey Democrat, pushed for this. And so that sort of exposed then this question about whether or not children were getting too much ethylmercury, which is a synthetic product. I mean, it's the difference between methyl alcohol and ethyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol is in beer and wine. We're exposed to that if you go to a party and drink anything like beer and wine. But methyl alcohol is added to gasoline and antifreeze, and can be poisonous at high concentrations.
So this discussion about thimerosal, what did it do to the anti-vaxxer community?
So the anti-vaccine community rallied around this hard and said, you have got to remove thimerosal from vaccines. Now, at the time, there were a lot of natural studies out there to be had. Western Europe had taken thimerosal out of vaccines in the early 1990s. By 1991, thimerosal was out of virtually all vaccines given in Europe. There were Canadian provinces that used thimerosal-containing vaccines right next to Canadian provinces that used the same vaccines that didn't contain thimerosal. So you could easily do these retrospective studies to answer the question, was thimerosal in vaccine causing harm? Was it causing either subtle or more overt neurodevelopmental problems? And it wasn't. Study after study after study, even in the early 2000s, had already shown that was true.
So why then did ACIP and the American Academy of Pediatrics support removal of thimerosal from vaccines?
I'm going to give you the real reason. The real reason were the events that were associated with that time. So this was around 1999, 2000. Andrew Wakefield published a paper in 1998 claiming that the combination measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism. Now, that wasn't true, and study after study showed that was true. But we were asked to vote on that. I was on the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices between 1998 and 2003. So we were asked to vote on separating the MMR vaccine into its three component parts, which Andrew Wakefield said would then basically dramatically reduce or eliminate autism. We were sort of forced to vote on that. We voted no, obviously, but it looked like we didn't care. Then RotaShield, which was a rotavirus vaccine made by Wyeth, it was introduced in 1998, was on the market for 10 months, given by mouth to babies at 2, 4, and 6 months of age. Well, 10 months into that vaccine, it was shown to be a very rare cause of intussusception, which is intestinal blockage. So we voted to remove that vaccine from the market. So here you have us approving a vaccine that was off the market in 10 months. You have us basically ignoring Andrew Wakefield's notion that the MMR vaccine caused autism. And now the Mercury issue came up. And I think that if you ask people at the time, why was it that we ended up basically saying that we should remove thimerosal-containing vaccines from the market, or said another way, move from multi-dose vials to single-dose vials for a number of these vaccines? It was because that way we look like we really did care about safety. But the problem is that we already knew at that time that thimerosal-containing vaccines didn't add substantially in any way to the burden of methylmercury that you were exposed to all the time. And more importantly, you already had a handful of studies showing that thimerosal at the level contained in vaccines didn't cause neurodevelopmental problems. But I think probably this was best expressed in July of 1999, by a press release from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which basically said, we are asking companies to remove thimerosal from vaccines, even though all the evidence to date shows that thimerosal at the level contained in vaccines is safe. By removing it, we'll make safe vaccines even safer. But it's safe, then taking it out doesn't make it safer. It just makes it perceived to be safer, which was a very different thing. So it was an anti-science recommendation. But it's the problem is that mercury never sounds good, right? It's not like there's a National Center for the Appreciation of Heavy Metals standing up in defense of mercury.
So what do you think personally? Do you think it should have been left in?
Yes, I voted no when all this came crashing down. I thought the science supports the notion that thimerosal at the level contained in vaccines is safe. So let's do that. Let's educate about how we're exposed to mercury in the environment. Let's educate about the studies that show that this isn't a problem. Because to me, that is how you do care about safety, which is that you You care because you need thimerosal in multi-dose vials. And in fact, what ended up happening is in the rush to get thimerosal out of vaccines or to move from multi-dose to single-dose vials, there was one 3-month-old child in Michigan who died of hepatitis B because the hospital where that child stayed was uncomfortable having a hepatitis B vaccine that contained thimerosal. That child never got that vaccine and ultimately died from an overwhelming hepatitis B infection. So what we really did was we elevated a theoretical risk above a real risk and did harm. So that's not the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle assumes that there is no harm, but we did do harm. And even more so, we made this vaccine much more expensive for the developing world. And it became not only an expense issue, but a storage issue for the developing world. And again, the vaccine became less available in the developing world. So we did harm.
So you write in the column that the removal of thimerosal was the wrong way to communicate theoretical risk. So if everyone wanted to remove it, what would have been a better way to communicate this? Instead of saying it's safe, we're going to make it safer, which is absurd. Is there a better way to communicate that?
Yes, thimerosal at the level contained in vaccines is safe. Ethyl mercury has a very short half-life. You were exposed to a type of mercury that has a much longer half-life that we deal with and manage every day, and just explain what it means to be on the surface of the earth and to be exposed to these light and heavy metals all the time. We're about to go through this again with aluminum, which is a light metal, but we needed to explain that and to even more so say, look, here are studies showing that this is not a problem. So we can be reassured that this is not a problem. I remember there was one committee hearing, and I think it was Frank Pallone, who said, when it comes to mercury, I have zero tolerance. So this is a congressional committee hearing. And I'm thinking, if you have zero tolerance for mercury, you got to move to another planet. Because on this planet, there's mercury.
That's good. You didn't tell him that, did you?
I didn't tell him that.
So RFK Jr. promoted the concept that thimerosal in vaccines causes autism. But what happened to autism rates after thimerosal was removed?
Right. So at the time, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote a book called Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak, where the science really didn't get a chance to speak at all, and claimed in part that this was one of the causes of autism. And so thimerosal was taken out of vaccines basically in 2000. It's more accurate to say that we moved from multi-dose to single-dose vials. It's not like you actually took thimerosal out of vaccine. So in 2000, the incidence of autism was 1 in 150. Now the thimerosal is out of vaccines. Today, the incidence of autism is 1 in 32. So the incidence of autism has only increased since the removal of thimerosal from vaccines.
And you would have predicted if it were a causative agent, it would have decreased, right?
Right.
And the increased incidence is probably all due to reporting, right?
Right. I think that's exactly right. I think it's there's a much greater awareness of autism. There are better diagnostic tests for autism. I think most importantly, we've expanded the definition of autism to include not just profound autism, but more autism spectrum disorder. So we've broadened the definition.
All right. So after that decision, thimerosal was removed from multi-dose vaccines, but up until recently, it was present in influenza multi-dose vaccines. So how did that come about?
Right. So there is one influenza vaccine that contains thimerosal that can be given to anybody over 6 years of age. And so what happened was RFK Jr. just instituted a series of things. One is he fired the ACIP. He fired 17 voting members from the ACIP. Then he replaced them with 7 people who are more like-minded, more likely to have an anti-science bias, more likely to be anti-vaccine. And then what he did is at that last committee meeting at the end of June, he had Lynn Redwood, who at the time, 25 years ago, formulated a group called Safe Minds, which was an anti-vaccine group against mercury in vaccines. So he had her present to this committee. Now, since then, she became a member of the Children's Health Defense, which is RFK Jr.'s anti-vaccine organization. So she actually presented to the committee. That would never happen normally because she's not a vaccine expert. She's not a subject matter expert. She's just an anti-vaccine activist, and her presentation was that, using some of the slides that already were in Children's Health Defense's slide deck. She quoted studies that didn't exist. She misrepresented studies. She didn't quote a single study of those roughly 10 studies now that have shown that thimerosal level in vaccines isn't harmful. She just gave false information. Normally, before you have a vote, you have to have something called ETR, which is evidence to recommendation, where subject matter experts review that talk to make sure it's accurate. Hers was never reviewed. So she gives basically this talk full of misinformation. And then of the 6 people that voted, 5 voted to remove basically this product, this thimerosal containing influenza vaccine for older people from the market. It was an anti-science vote. And I think it sets him up for a future of anti-science votes.
I'm just wondering how, if thimerosal was eliminated from vaccines in 1999, how did it remain in the multi-dose flu vaccine?
Well, so the interest was in removing it from vaccines given to young people. So there was no vaccine available then for, say, children less than 6 years of age.
I got it. Okay. So tell us, how do you think this is a warm-up for removing aluminum salts from vaccines?
Well, so now he's got his ducks in a row, RFK Jr. And so he said he wants to take a closer look at aluminum adjuvants in vaccines. And this is not something that you can take out. It's aluminum adjuvants are in 7 vaccines given to infants and young children. They're necessary because especially single protein vaccines like the hepatitis B vaccine or human papillomavirus vaccine aren't highly immunogenic and require really an adjuvant to allow for lesser quantities of the antigen and fewer doses. You need adjuvants in certain vaccines. They're not in live attenuated viral vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella, rotavirus, varicella, but they are in some other vaccines. So now he's going to have the ACIP, this new look ACIP, this now science-averse anti-vaccine ACIP, look at the issue of this aluminum adjuvants. And he's also hired a law firm out of Arizona to kind of reconfigure the vaccine injury compensation program. What I fear is going to happen, and I hope I'm wrong, is that sometime in the next few months, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will hold up some bogus paper that says that aluminum adjuvants cause autism or diabetes or multiple sclerosis or asthma or eczema, and that he wants the ACIP to comment on that. And this ACIP may well say that they're worried about these things, and then he would manipulate the vaccine injury compensation program to either add these things like autism to a list of compensable injuries, or worse, take vaccines out of that program, out of the protection of that program, which is where we were in the 1980s when these companies were subjected to the slings and outrages of bogus litigation that basically drove companies off the market. We had 18 companies that made vaccines in 1980. By the end of the decade, we had 4. It's a fragile market, and attack it enough, and these companies will stop making vaccines.
Is there any evidence that aluminum salts are harmful in any way?
No. In fact, there was an amazing paper that was just published in the Annals of Internal Medicine a couple days ago. It was done by Anders Vid in Denmark, which has a national health service, which therefore makes it much easier to do these kinds of studies. He looked at a little over 1.2 million children between 1997 and 2020, so that's a 23-year span, during which time children got, different quantities of aluminum in vaccines. So you could look on a milligram per milligram basis over that 23-year period to see whether or not there was any problem with any particular disorder. So he looked at 50 different disorders under the categories of neurodevelopmental problems, autoimmune problems, or allergic problems, and found that the aluminum in vaccines didn't cause any of those problems, which is what you would imagine, since the amount of aluminum in vaccines is trivial compared to what you're exposed to every day. You will ingest 7 to 9 milligrams of aluminum every day. The total amount of aluminum you will get in your lifetime from vaccines is about 4.5 milligrams. So 4.5 milligrams in a lifetime as compared to ingesting 7 to 9 milligrams every day. So obviously, what Vid found is exactly what you would expect, is that aluminum salts in vaccines were not a problem.
So is RFK all about making him and his personal injury lawyer friends rich?
Yes, and that I think is at least, I think that's certainly that's a bonus. I do believe that he thinks that vaccines have simply replaced infectious diseases with chronic diseases. I think he thinks he's doing good. I think he's a zealot. He's recently said that he thinks that he was put on this earth by God to eliminate chronic disease, and he thinks vaccines are one of those reasons.
I asked God for 19 years to put me in a position where I could end the chronic disease epidemic and bring health back to our children.
And so I do think he believes it. Which makes him all the more dangerous. But I think that he will also make himself rich. And when Elizabeth Warren interviewed him or questioned him during that second confirmation hearing in front of the Health Committee, she basically said, look, you can reconfigure the vaccine injury compensation program to make yourself wealthy or your personal injury lawyer friend's wealthier, will you agree not to do that? And he wouldn't say no.
I'm not going to agree to not sue drug companies or anybody.
So I do worry that that's where we're heading. He wants to make vaccines less available, less affordable, and more feared. He is a zealot, and he is going to do everything he can.
Unfortunately, many children in particular may die before he is taken away and not allowed to do this any longer.
It's already happening. I mean, we've had the biggest measles outbreak we've had this year in more than 30 years. We've had 3 people die of measles. That's the same number as the last 25 years in this country. We had our first child death from measles this year since 2003. We had 260 deaths in children this year from influenza. We haven't seen those numbers since 2009. You've had a handful of states where children are dying from pertussis. That hasn't happened in years. It's already happening, and he's standing back and watching it happen.
And in fact, the outbreak, the measles outbreak, could likely have been stopped by aggressive vaccination, right?
Right. And he never said that. He always talked about personal choice, and he talked about treating with vitamin A.
Well, we'll put a link to this column in the show notes so you can read it for yourself. That's Beyond the Noise with Dr. Paul Offit. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Vincent.